Good morning, everyone. What a thrill and a pleasure to be here with all of you today in this Zoom room to spend time together, taking a step back from the daily work of clinical family medicine, of education and research, and all of the things you all do every day, and spend some time together. Thank you, Allison and Danielle and the entire faculty development team for all of the hard work that has gone into planning the day today. I know it's going to be a terrific conference, and it's a thrill to see how many people have registered. My name's Danielle Martin. I'm a family physician. My clinical practice is at Women's College Hospital, and I'm the chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at Temerity Medicine, University of Toronto. And before I welcome and introduce our opening speaker, I want to introduce you to this series, which we're launching today, the Chair Speaker Series called New Horizons, and speak a little bit about the purpose of the series and the wonderful image that you see on your screen. This speaker series is about dreaming big, about the future of primary care, about family medicine, and about the role of our department in a changing world. The intent of the series is to acknowledge that if we want to be part of positive change in service of health, we're going to need to challenge ourselves to think more broadly and to get advice from wise colleagues and perspectives from the broadest range of fields, from the arts, from public health, from community activism, from social sciences, and more. It's my hope that the fresh perspectives provided by the wonderful colleagues we'll be hearing from over the course of the speakers series this year will help us to challenge our own thinking and to think more deeply about our role as family physicians, educators, researchers, and the role of our department. This can feed into our strategic planning exercise that's just getting underway, but also to the conversations we have with one another as we think about our work. The image you see on your screen is a wonderful photograph, a work of art by an artist named Meryl McMaster. She's a Canadian artist with Plains, Cree, Dutch, and British ancestry. The name of this photograph, which really spoke to me, is Lead Me to Places I Could Never Find on My Own. It's actually a two-part series. This is the second part. And it's part of a bigger body of work called As Immense as the Sky. And we're going to post Meryl's website in the chat, and I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with her work, to check it out. She's a spectacular artist. I'd like to read to you a little bit about this piece as described by Meryl herself, in which she talks about the stars, which have the potential to guide us and help us to navigate in many kinds of exploration. And I quote, "Stories of the constellations have been passed down over generations within both Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures. Humans and animals have used the stars to navigate for thousands of years and still do so to this day. As the stars become hidden by light pollution, we start to lose our way." This image was taken at the Badlands in Grasslands National Park, a dark sky preserve and a preservation area for one of the largest tracts of natural grassland in North America. The Badlands were not touched by glaciation during the last ice age, so the landscape revels isolated buttes, weathered outcroppings, eroded gullies, and more. Perched atop my hat are the indigo bunting birds who use the stars to navigate. Carrying the universe, they lead me to the stars as I seek answers in the sky. For this series, I hope that we can draw on many different traditions of navigation as we chart our way as a department and a discipline. We're fortunate today to have Dr. Sandro Galea as our inaugural speaker, but I want to put in a quick plug for our upcoming sessions. On June 17th, we'll be joined by Frankie Aberland, a listener poet who spends his time listening to healthcare providers and sharing their stories in the form of poetry. I have one of his poems tacked to a bulletin board at home. We'll be discussing the power of deep listening and what that can mean for primary care and family medicine. After Frankie, we'll have a short summer break, and then we'll be joined by Professor Michelle Murphy, an environmental and data justice scholar, and Dr. Beth Coleman to talk smart tech, critical race theory, and civic engagement in the fall. You can find more information and the registration links using the link you see on the screen. And if you've got ideas or suggestions for upcoming speakers, you can send me a quick email anytime. So with that, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Sandro Galea to kick off this Chair Speakers series. Dr. Galea is a physician, an epidemiologist, and an author who is also, of course, Dean and Robert A. Knox Professor at Boston University School of Public Health. Dr. Galea is one of the most widely cited scholars in the social sciences, publishing and speaking regularly about the social causes of health, mental health, and the consequences of trauma, among many other topics. While most of his work is now in the US, he holds a medical degree from our very own University of Toronto, and we consider him an alumni and a friend. We're going to post his the link to his entire bio in the chat. And if you haven't read his most recent book entitled The Contagion Next Time, I encourage you to do so. It's a phenomenal read. And in fact, we're going to be giving the first 50 registrants of the conference today and our speakers a copy as well. One of the things that I found most powerful about the book, and it links very much to the conversations we've been having about the pandemic here in Canada, is the sentiment that much of what happened over the last couple of years was not really about failures of medicine. They were failures of social and economic structures. I would say that in medicine in general, and including in family medicine in particular, we are always at risk of paying attention to testing, vaccination, and now treatment, sometimes at the expense of or to the exclusion of paying attention to the bigger social and structural causes that influence health. Of course, as family physicians, we see the impact of those factors on the health of our patients. And so it's my pleasure to now pass over to Dr. Galea to share more about his work and his thoughts about how we as family physicians and as an academic department can help address the foundational forces shaping health in our society. Sandro, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, and thank you all for having me here today. Thank you all for joining. It's really an honor and privilege to be here with you as a family physician and as a U of T graduate. It's really delightful to be back home. Let me share my screen. Okay. So as Dr. Martin mentioned, I am currently, and I've been for the past 20 years in my academic career in the United States. So I am going to use some American data, American examples, but hopefully the lessons that I'm extracting from the pandemic, I think, are eminently generalizable to Canada and to anywhere else. But really my point in this presentation is to start us on the process of trying to bring clarity and sharpness to our thoughts about the pandemic. I realize that there is a certain hubris in using the term after a pandemic, since we, of course, don't actually know exactly where we're at in the pandemic. But the argument I'm making here is that it's not too soon to start thinking about what has happened and what can we learn from it. Because as I'm going to make the case in a second, the pandemic has been a tragedy for so many, and there's no way to redeem a tragedy. But certainly we will be doing a disservice to the lives lost if we do not learn from the moment. So with that framing, I have no relevant conflicts to this talk. So let me start with the pandemic. You know, we have all lived the pandemic. You've all lived the pandemic clinically, lived it on both sides of the border or throughout the world. This is just a simple map looking at density of cases with about 500 million cumulative cases worldwide, about 6 million cumulative deaths. We have lived the bit of the roller coaster of cases rising and falling, rising and falling. And I often refer to this slide because I think the slide captures for me how the past 2.5 years have felt for me. And I think for all of us, this is a map of the US, obviously, and from the New York Times. And they used to color in the case density with red. And the reason I show this map is if you're an alien landing on the planet and you looked at this map, even if you didn't know what this stood for, you knew there was nothing good, right? Because it felt like the whole country was on fire. I think it felt the same way on your side of the border. I always look back on this. This is 2 years ago. This is a New York Times headline with the caps bold headline: U.S. deaths near 100,000 and incalculable loss. And they're correct, of course. 100,000 wasn't an incalculable loss. Now in the U.S., we're about to hit 1 million deaths. And so I think it really reminds us of how deep and profound the impact of this pandemic was. And in being in public health, I think there is often a danger of losing sight of what 1 million people actually means. And I did, before I moved more into lessons from the moment, to remember for a second that 1 million people is 1 million friends, lovers, wives, husbands, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. It's 1 million people, and that's just in the US, 6 million worldwide. So it's really hard for us as humans to wrap our brain around those numbers. So I think it's important to remember that we are talking about people's lives who are foreshortened, and it is as such directly within our responsibility set as physicians and scholars in health to think about how is it that we can learn from the moment to mitigate the consequences of such crises, and as I'm going to talk in a second, to do better by our responsibility in health overall. So I'm talking about learning from the pandemic, and I'm only going to speak for about 20 minutes, so I want to be fairly brief about this. But my fundamental argument is, going from left to right, is I want to talk about the overall burden, the inequities and burden, and some of the social fracturing that emerged from the pandemic, which I think really is what went wrong in the pandemic. Then I'll move to the middle to talk about what caused those problems, and then I'll move to the right, which is the root causes of those problems. So let me start with what really went wrong in the pandemic: the overall burden, inequities and burden, and the social fracturing. The burden of the pandemic has been, I've already made the case about the 1 million deaths in the US, 6 million deaths worldwide, but it really has been quite extraordinary all over the world, particularly when it's hit. In the US, the pandemic has been the third leading cause of death. This is 2020, 2021 data are not out, but they're going to look roughly the same. So COVID was the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer, which at this point in the pandemic, I think you can all say, well, we know that, but it's actually hard to remember. Like if I were to tell you today that in 2025, a new disease is going to come along that is named by some sequence of letters in combination that you've never heard of before, and it's going to come from nowhere and become the third leading cause of death, I think that's enough to stiffen our spines and to say, what's pretty terrible? What can we do to prevent it? That's exactly what COVID came and did. In the US, COVID resulted in a downturn in life expectancy, unlike any that we have seen since the 1918 pandemic in some subgroups in World War II. We've lost about 2 years in life expectancy. And these burdens have been deeply unequally distributed. So on the far right here, you see life expectancy in the US among white women. It's about a 0.7-year life expectancy loss. And just to put that in context, while we've had life expectancy losses in the US for several times over the past 100 years, they typically are in the range of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. So 0.7 is pretty huge. If you go to the left, you see that among Black men, our life expectancy loss has been 3 years, which is really, really unmatched, except in World War II, among young men who were being sent off to war. That's really, I think, the only analogy that holds here. Now, I'm showing this in the context of racial differences, certainly in the American experience, and I think it's also in the Canadian experience. One can trace the consequence of COVID inequitably across all dimensions of marginalization and vulnerability. For example, showing you this graph, this looks at within different racial ethnic groups by education. From left to right, you have within American Indians, Alaska Natives, Asian, etc. Within each racial ethnic group, you have education going from less education to more education, and this looks at mortality. So you see within each racial ethnic group, there's less mortality as people are more educated. And this was true. I can show you this for immigrant status. I can show you this for wealth. I can show you this for income. Essentially, by any index of vulnerability, there was greater burden of COVID, which I'll get to in a second as to why that was. And then the third part that was part of the consequence of COVID was that certainly in the US, and I know it also was the case in Canada, we had this confluence of COVID and the inequities experienced by COVID, coupled with deep civil unrest, with this awakening about long-seated, particularly racial injustices, although it also has undertones of economic injustices that have been with us for many decades. This was, of course, triggered in the US by the police killing of unarmed Black men and women, particularly George Floyd. And all of these came together to really result in massive social fracturing at around the time of a pandemic, which is, if you think about it, if there's ever a time when one can expect collective unity, it's when there is a sort of an external threat like a pandemic. But instead, in this context of the pandemic, it resulted in this total social fracturing built on the inequity and built on the absolute burden. And then that social fracturing spilled over into a number of efforts that were being put in place to try to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic, like things like school closures and masking. And this is a protest around school closures. So number one is to what happened in the pandemic: terrible overall burden, inequitable burden, and social fracturing. Number two is what caused that? What caused what went wrong? Well, I argued what caused the three things: technical shortfalls, antecedent inequities, and communication challenges. So let me just talk about each one of them. Well, in terms of technical shortfalls, I actually start with technical success, because the pandemic was actually met with enormous technical success in the rapid development of not one, but two highly efficacious mRNA vaccines within 8 months of first diagnosis of the pathogen. This is unprecedented. The fastest we had ever gotten to a vaccine was with the mumps vaccine, which took us 3 years in terms of the effort. So that was a technical triumph. However, the technical triumph quickly faltered when it came for us in terms of delivering vaccine. This is the American map of vaccine delivery, showing that in many parts of the country, we only succeeded in about delivering 30% of vaccine, while other parts we succeeded in delivering 90%. That is fundamentally technical shortcoming in our ability to deliver vaccines. And worse yet, our ability to deliver vaccines was really gave light to the Julian Tudor Hart inverse care law from 50 years ago. In 1971, Julian Tudor Hart in a paper in The Lancet wrote about the inverse care law, which is essentially that those who need care most are least likely to get it. And if you look here at the top row, each of these bubbles is a US county. The top row is the most vulnerable county, the bottom row is the least vulnerable county, and you see the vaccination, more vaccination we're able to get to the least vulnerable counties than the most vulnerable counties. So behind what went wrong in the pandemic, where we had a number of technical shortfalls, this testing, failure of contact tracing and all that. Behind what went wrong in the pandemic were the underlying inequities that characterized the country. The US has had 20-year life expectancy differences between counties with lowest and highest life expectancy. As I said earlier, I know I'm using US data, but I'm also familiar enough with Canadian data to know that a lot of this extends very well to Canada. And in the context of racial differences, which in the US have been particularly described most boldly in terms of Black-white differences, those of course reflect underlying inequities that have been with us for decades and centuries. When you look at Black-white differences, this is pre-COVID, this is over time. The purple line is Black American, the blue line is white American. You see that Black Americans have had higher unemployment rate, lower college completion rate, lower household income, lower home ownership, higher incarceration rate, and lower life expectancy at birth than white Americans for decades and centuries before COVID. So really, COVID, in terms of there were inequities experienced in COVID, none of that was new. That was simply elevating and bringing to a fore inequities that existed before. And of course, these underlying, apart from these technical shortcomings and these underlying inequities, they were not just the underlying inequities in health, there were also underlying inequities in economic opportunity that resulted in challenges to how one did in COVID. For example, when a new pathogen emerges, for which we have no vaccine and no treatment, the only thing we really knew to protect ourselves was, well, to stay inside, to stay away. And much of that manifested in working remotely. Of course, who could work remotely? Well, those who could work remotely were those with higher income. This is data from Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US showing the higher income you have, the more likely you are to be able to work remotely. So that resulted in those who had lower income, who were disproportionately people of color, being less able to work remotely, and as a result, at higher risk of getting COVID. And then those groups were not only at higher risk of getting COVID, they were actually more likely to have severe COVID when they got COVID. This looks at household income again on the x-axis. The yellow bar looks at underlying illness makes you vulnerable to COVID. The higher the income you have, the lower your likelihood of having underlying illness makes you vulnerable to COVID. So these underlying inequities, pre-existing inequities in health, in economic opportunity, and in underlying illness became the inequities that we saw during COVID. And then just to make one last point about the social fracturing that I said emerged during COVID, that social fracturing was overlaid on an already fractured society. This is on American ideology. What you see is red-blue parties. They were much closer together on ideological reasons 20 years ago than they have been now. So really, the point is that the burden of COVID, the inequities of COVID, the social fracturing that happened in COVID really were a direct result of the underlying poor health, of our underlying technical shortfalls, which I'll get to in a second, underlying inequities and underlying challenges with communication that as a country. And that, of course, is beginning to point to what it is that we should be taking from COVID, because the media and the public conversation around COVID is bad things happened during COVID. But the shift in this thinking, if you follow my logic, is that the bad things that happened during COVID were not COVID. The bad things happening in COVID were already there before COVID. COVID simply elevated them and made them visible. And that puts us in a very different mindset as to what we should do about COVID. If we just think that's about COVID, then once COVID's over, we're going to say, well, what we should do is just focus on vaccines. If we realize that what happened during COVID was actually already happening and COVID made us see them, it shifts what we should be doing. And that really points to me to a different direction. And then the third thing is sort of in the COVID diagnosis, what were the root causes of the things that went wrong? And I argue there are three root causes: underinvestment in systems and health, and our challenges of politics and science. So underinvestment in systems in the US, we've underinvested in health departments for decades. You see a decrease in local and state health departments. Our state and local governments, we spend less than 3% on health of populations. And I know that, for example, you've read about failures in the US, like our failure as a country to come up with a test in a timely way. Well, that a lot of that was laid at the feet of the CDC. But of course, the lab in a country the size of the US, the lab that was in charge of developing a test on which the entire COVID response hinged on was actually a lab with only 3 full-time employees. So we've long underinvested in the systems that could protect us from something like COVID. And we've also underinvested in health. We've underinvested in conditions that generate health. You know, I live in Massachusetts, I live in Boston. Massachusetts is widely considered, probably correctly, the most progressive of American states. And often the state most like Canada. But when you look at spending in Massachusetts over a 15-year period, for example, you see that we spend 100% more on healthcare and the same or less on things like transportation, housing, primary, secondary education, mental health, higher education, early childhood care, environmental recreation. So essentially, as a country, we have underinvested for decades in making sure people have stable income, people are not homeless, make sure there's parks and recreation, minimizing mental health. And all of that is what set the stage then for us to be sitting ducks to the consequences of something like COVID. And then last comment about the politics and the science, because I talked about the underlying division, communication divide, social fracturing. That really came on a very divided society. And I could talk a lot about social divisions, but I want to just point the finger internally, look at us, because there have been a lot of fractures that have been revealed in COVID, not the least of which is how science is complicit in a science media political complex in not thinking carefully about our responsibility to broader populations. As I'm going to come to in a second, this is where I think a great Department of Family and Community Medicine can really fill a role. When you look at who did well and who didn't do well in terms of COVID, this is a graph indexed on things like mental health, personal finances, physical health, personal life, etc. Below the line means you did worse during the pandemic. Above the line, you did better. Well, the only group that really did better is people with postgraduate educations, which is what you see over here right in the middle, which is of course all of us in this room. So there is this fracturing of opportunity landscapes, which results in us seeing the world perhaps differently, which resulted, for example, in the academic world doing things like advocate for no COVID, for zero COVID cases, advocated no less in a journal like The Lancet on the left, which of course gives then weight and credence to things that have happened in many parts of the world, not least of which being in China right now with this enormous draconian shutdown, locking sort of tens of millions of people inside their homes. So I think science itself, as part of an academic media political complex, has a lot of work to do in looking at itself. And I actually think this is where an outstanding academic department of primary care can actually fill a void, because I think departments of family medicine are much closer to populations that are many other parts of the academy. And I think this is where you have an opportunity to lead. So having said, this is what went wrong on the left, what caused it in the middle, and the root causes on the right. I want to move then to this, to the opportunity for community-embedded academic departments of family and community medicine. And I would argue there are 3 opportunities. There are 3 areas that the world should move forward. And hope you'll all see that I think there are areas in which an academic family community medicine department can really lead. And that these 3 areas are focus on health, to do better value-informed science, and to shift the health conversation. I'll start with a focus on health. I think we need to change how we think about health, and we need to learn from COVID to inform other conversations. Everybody in this room knows that healthcare, as shown here in this picture from the Institute for Clinical Systems Improvement, accounts for maybe 10–20% of health. Much of health is due to our behaviors, tobacco use, diet, alcohol use, where we live, family social support, our education, our income, community safety. Well, that is all directly nested in the community. And that is how we need to think about health. And who else can actually help shift our thinking on that than folks whose academic home is in the Department of Community Medicine, where you actually understand this both intuitively and I think have a particular place in society to be able to push this argument. And then the learning from COVID to inform other conditions, I think, is critical, because the world is not going to forget COVID anytime soon, although the world does move on shockingly quickly. But I think our job is to make sure that not forgetting about COVID means that the lessons of COVID are not just applied to pandemics. I think it will be a real loss if what we learn from this is need to develop better vaccines, have better stockpiling, have better testing, because fundamentally, COVID shown us this, how fragile our health is, how our fragile underlying health is. And for example, in the US, we had this enormous increase in overdose deaths, about 30% increase over the year before. And all of that really shows how fragile our ecosystem within which our health is generated. And what we should take from COVID is that we need to invest in the things that I talked about earlier that actually create better health. There's many different looks at future of primary care, and this is simply one of them. And what always distresses me a little bit about these things is how infrequently some of the agenda that I'm talking about here is actually mentioned in forward-looking future of primary care type documents. And I suppose one has a choice. You can either disagree with everything I'm saying, which is fine. We can disagree and then we can argue about it. But if one agrees with this thesis, then surely it should be at the heart of a future forward-looking academic primary care unit. This is a paper which I wrote, and many others have written papers like this about how physicians can grapple with these issues. I think there's a growing body of thought about how this can become part of the practice and the scholarship and the education of medicine overall. And to my mind, that should be led by academic primary care. The second is to do better value-informed science. And again, I'm really thinking about the science that can be done being led by departments of academic primary care. And I think that is a science that is humble and compassionate. And I think it's actually different than the science that was done during COVID. I like this quote from a paper which said, with a lot at stake, it's wise to be humble when faced with fundamental limitations. I would argue that science was not humble in a time of COVID. I think we leaned into giving dispositive prescriptions when often that was the wrong thing to do. We embraced ideas like follow the science as though science had an answer and nobody else did. And I think it's time for us to do a really careful rethink of how we do our science. This is a piece which I wrote on Scientific American in the height of the pandemic. I'll talk about science can do in a time of the pandemic, which we can talk about in the Q&A session. And by radical compassion, I mean to be clear that the consequences of something like COVID, as well as the consequences of poor health on a day-to-day basis, are not felt evenly. It is not accurate to say that that health needs to pay equal attention to the whole population. Health needs to make sure that we focus on those who need help the most. I go back to the inverse care law. The fact that those who need care the most are the ones who are least likely to get it is a travesty, and we should be fixing that. It is people who were working in retail, in housekeeping, in trucking. Those are the people who actually were most likely to get COVID, to get sick from COVID. And those are the people who deserve most of our attention. And similarly, that is where our scholarship and our practice should be focused in health. And third and last point is changing the health conversation. I think there is no better groups that's suited to changing the health conversation than academic family physicians who are intersecting again with the community on a day-to-day basis and who recognize that our health is shaped by the world around us much more than it is by healthcare. You know, me saying that might seem obvious, and you might be saying, yeah, we know that, but actually it's not obvious to the population. This is from a survey that we just did recently of 8 countries around the world, asking people what primarily causes your health, giving them a list, asking them to check things off. And what you see is the most commonly checked off is healthcare. The least commonly checked off is politics. And if I were to do this, I would actually make politics would be the first thing I would check off. And I think this shows how far we are from the population understanding of what really generates health. You know, when you look at things like books on health, which you can do in a quiet moment over right now, if you're multitasking, you'll see there are many excellent books on health. They're almost always told through the lens of curative care and clinical medicine. And I think that's exactly the kind of narrative on health that we need to change. I'm going to conclude. I'm going to stop there. I'll just end with one slide to say that I think what I'm proposing actually is a tall order. I think changing the health conversation, doing better value-informed science, focusing on health in a comprehensive way actually is far from where we are in health right now. But I do think that it can be done if we invest in it. You know, I think actually COVID, Dr. Martin mentioned at the beginning, and I agree with it. If I give you a longer talk, I would actually have shown data on this. Healthcare did very well in a time of COVID. There are ample data to show that once people were in hospitals, they actually did well in time of COVID. Healthcare was not the problem, and neither was technology. You know, this is a paper from 10 years ago in 2012. And I love this paper because it has this line, which, you know, I wish in any of my papers I'd ever written a line as prescient that says mRNA presents a promising vector that may well become the basis of a game-changing vaccine technology platform. Now, the reason that I like this line is, of course, it was exactly correct. But the point I want to make with this last slide is that the reason we had such a success with the technical triumph of getting vaccines because we had invested in vaccines for 20 years. The reason we had failed so badly in other aspects of COVID is we did not invest in these other aspects of COVID for more 20, 40 years. And this is the world that we need to change. And I can think of no better group to change that than an elite academic family community medicine department. Dr. Martin mentioned my book, and anybody's interested in this, the book is sort of expands on this thesis, perhaps with slightly better anecdotes. I will stop there. Thank you very much for having me.
Tremendous. Thank you so much, Sandro. An amazing talk. And really, I think, as you can see from all of the Zoom applause, resonates with our experience in Canada as well. I have a few questions. I'm hoping to engage in some back and forth, the two of us, and then in another 5 or 10 minutes or so, we'll turn to the Q&A. And so I invite all those who are here to put your questions in the Q&A and upvote those that look interesting to you, so that we can address as many of them as possible. But I want to come back to this this notion of humility and compassion in science, because I think it's a really critical point that you make. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about what you think humble and compassionate science looks like. You know, we're in a academic environment. There's tons of research happening all over our university. Our folks in our own research area, you know, we're about to hear from a panel of many of our research leaders who are doing tremendous work that's quite community relevant. And I wonder if we could respond to your call, what would that look like in our scientific and research enterprise?
Yeah, I'll start with humility, and perhaps I'll answer that by looking at its antonym, arrogance. You know, arrogance means not recognizing what one does not know, not having the wisdom to realize the certitude with which we know certain things. And that manifested manyfold in a time of COVID, where we saw the science rushing in to fill the public space with certitude about particular observations that really turned out to be wrong, and that really moved the public conversation in wrong ways. Now, the question is, why is that? So why did that happen? And, you know, I think there's obviously our egos, and, you know, we're all human, that's fine. But I actually think there's a larger reason why that is. The larger reason why that is because we lost faith that the people, and I'm using the word the people intentionally here, can handle uncertainty. And we actually lost faith that if people are not told this is exactly the answer, that people will not behave the right way. And in fact, the irony about that, there's actually good science that shows that people can handle uncertainty. There's actually good science that shows that when people have uncertainty communicated to them, and I suspect many of you know the science about that from the context of clinical care. In one-to-one clinical care, there's very good data that when patients are told, this is what we think is the case, but here's why we don't know it, that does not decrease their confidence in their provider. In fact, it increases their confidence in their provider. There's equivalently data about that at the population health level, but we somehow forgot that. We somehow felt like people could not handle the truth. I mean, you're seeing it. You know, I realize that vaccines are a bit of a sort of a holy grail in our circles, but I would argue, for example, that the damage that's happening now by the careful reexamination, you saw the news about the J&J vaccine now, about the side effects of the vaccine, contrasting with what we told people a year ago, which is these vaccines are totally safe, there's no side effects, is really deep and lasting. And I think it loses trust. So I suppose it's an argument towards a science that is aware of what we know and of what we don't know, and is not afraid of communicating that and recognizing that in the long term, that is better for us than short. You know, in the US, there have been fairly egregious examples of where there were sort of the orthodoxy shut down any unorthodox perspectives on COVID, largely driven, again, by good intentions, by saying, this is such a crisis that we cannot have disagreement in public. And I just think that's a mistake. Now I'll come to compassion. You know, I think, obviously I spoke quickly about covering many topics, but the point I was trying to make about compassion means caring about everybody, and particularly those who need to be cared about the most. And the point I was trying to make is that we in the science are actually quite far from the people who need caring. Like, we actually occupy, we don't like to think of ourselves this way. We don't like to think of ourselves as being elite members of society with enormous privileges. I really appreciated the opening framing with discussing by Dr. Merbaum, discussing privileges that we all inhabit. And perhaps the conversation in Canada is a bit wiser than it is in the United States. But I think we forget that we bring a lens of privilege to everything we do, and we need to actively work against that in order to make sure that our science is focused principally on those who need the help of the science the most. Because fundamentally, and I've written about this, I see the work of health as a pragmatic science. It is important to do science to advance knowledge, absolutely. But that is built on a scaffold of caring for the health of populations and doing what we do in order to improve the health of populations.
So that's a profound set of observations, and I'll be interested to speak with our researchers more about how they think we might make manifest that perspective in our research work. I want to ask about education because it is of course a core function of what we do as an academic department. And I would say, I think, I could be wrong and people can challenge me if they wish, but I think that overall, medical education has really come a long way in a positive sense around teaching about the social determinants of health, the inequitable impacts of all kinds of different health issues on different populations, the health impacts of colonialism, of racism, of economic inequality. And we've begun to do some work of the kind that you call for in your paper about, on the ground, what can we do as family doctors? How do you screen for poverty? How do you respond when someone says they can't make ends meet at the end of the month? How do you interact in the one-on-one with a person who's experienced racism in the healthcare system and doesn't have trust, et cetera? But we don't necessarily yet, I would posit, have a great way of educating our physicians to respond at the community level to the forces that you're describing. And I'm wondering what an education system that takes into account what you have just illustrated for us would look like in your view. How would we train doctors differently, family doctors differently to make this change in the world that you're asking us to make?
Yeah, so I think that's an easy question because you answered it in your lead, and I actually think the education system should be exactly what you said for the past minute as you were framing the question, and I mean that. I'm not actually trying to dodge the question. When you ask about education, it's this is where I lean into optimism, because I do think that our trainees are better. Speak for myself, than far better than I was at that level, and I actually think they're much more attuned to these issues than we were 20, 30 years ago. And I think that's a combination of the trainees coming to medicine, coming to postgraduate training with a lens that's already more expansive, and of these ideas penetrating systems and shaping how we educate. Are we there? No. I mean, I could give a whole hour presentation about how we fall short in our education, where we can be better. But I think we're much better now than we were in the 90s and in the aughts and these things. So I think, Danielle, as you set up the question, I think you actually articulated the agenda of education that we need to embrace collectively within health. And I do mean what I said several times in my talk, that I think academic departments of family medicine, community medicine, primary care, any such name, can be at the vanguard of this, because at the end of the day, you are much more linked to the needs of populations and much more attuned to them, that where I think it'll be easier for all of medicine to be led by primary care on this. And so I actually am excited about innovation, educational innovation, that can emerge from a department like yours, from a leading department of family community medicine, that I think it can truly be transformative, not just for family community medicine, but for all of medicine. So
building on that then, and I'll turn to the chat and the Q&A in just a moment, but maybe I'm more pessimistic than you are. I worry that our interventions at the individual level are necessary but not sufficient. And Maybe this links to the question that Brent Elsie has posed in the Q&A about physicians traditionally having steered away from, quote, getting involved in politics, you know, the determinant that you would rank as the most important one for health. You know, we've been exploring the possibility of growing our division of clinical public health, just as an example. I think that we recognize our obligations to individuals, but I'm not sure that we yet, as a discipline, and my colleagues can, you know, disagree with me if they wish, I'm not sure that we understand what it means to take care of communities yet. And I'm wondering what that looks like to you.
Yeah, so I have many answers because there were many pieces of the question. Let me start with optimism and pessimism. You know, one of my favorite aphorisms actually comes from a distinguished Canadian scholar at the University of Ottawa, Ron LaBonde, who said a few years ago that optimism is a form of political resistance. And so I choose optimism. That's number one. Number two, I don't think that optimism is unfounded, because I would challenge everybody here to say, if you could choose a time in history to live, would you choose any time other than today? And I would argue that actually it's very hard to choose any time in history but today, because actually a lot of things are better. In fact, if I could choose, I would choose tomorrow. Things go back, we have steps forward, steps back. I think that's true, but I think we all recognize that. But the truth is that we actually are dealing with things much better than we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That's the second part. Now, the third part is about how a department, you said, we recognize our individual responsibility, and do we tackle our responsibility to populations? I suppose the questions I would pose to everybody is it discretionary that you tackle the health of populations? And I would argue it's not. Once you recognize that the health of individuals is inextricable with the health of with the broader health of a community, how can you not tackle that? And yeah, let's use a concrete example. I mean, for anybody who has ever done a shift in an emergency department, you know that when the same person comes back night after night with the same injuries that need stitching up, etc., I mean, you know, well, I'm going to keep doing that, and that person's still going to be coming back, because the fundamental issue is that their social circumstances are such that they keep injuring themselves. So to my mind, we in medicine have a first responsibility to make sure that that person is treated, right? And we should not lose sight of that. I mean, that is the job of medicine. And when I'm sick, I want the best doctor. When you're sick, you want the best doctor. That's number one. But surely our responsibility doesn't end there. It seems to me almost willfully blind to say, we just deal with them when they walk in through the door. You know, we just deal with that person when he walks into the door. And yeah, we realize that the problem is the social circumstances dealing with, but that's not our job. Like it just seems to me like we are drawing artificial boundaries as to what is our job. You know, this exploded in a bit of a contretemps in the US around firearms, which is a particular American sin around the sort of not my lane. And I would argue that health is our lane, and whatever drives health is our lane. Now, that's not meant to minimize how hard this is. Like I don't have any magic wand as to how does an academic department of family and community medicine actually tackle some of these underlying social and economic issues. And there's ultimately, we all have scopes that are limited by the institutions that we are in. But certainly, I don't want an academic department of family and community medicine to say that's not our problem. I actually think, I mean, if you, and by you I mean collectively, do not articulate the need for particular social economic transformation to the end of making people healthy, who's going to do that? I would challenge to say, if not your job, then whose job is it?
Right. I mean, beautifully put. And coming back to this question of politics, I think it was Virchow who said that politics is just medicine on a grand scale, or perhaps it was the inverse that he said. But this is the case. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to the interplay between advocacy, firearms being an example of that, and science, and where would you, if you were in our shoes, how would you find that balance between science and advocacy when it comes to the clearly political causes of health?
Yeah, I think very carefully. I think it's a tricky balance to find, and just to take it a step back and also up a level, because I'm often asked this question. I in no way do think ever that every individual academic or every individual practitioner needs to be all things to all. I think we as individuals have strengths and weaknesses, and I think it's our responsibility is to recognize what those strengths are, what those weaknesses are, and to act in a way that maximizes the impact we can have towards the mission that we subscribe to. So that's we as individuals. Now, we as individuals choose to be a part of entities larger than ourselves. In this case, you all are part of the Department of Family and Community Medicine. And I think it is the responsibility of the collective entity to engage in multiple areas, to engage in clinical, in education, in advocacy where appropriate. And that's different though than the individual's responsibility. So to come to your question, I do think that there are scholars who navigate carefully the line between the dispassionate science and advocacy. I think it's actually quite a difficult line to navigate at the individual level. I think it's actually quite a difficult line to navigate within one's own head. I think it's a much easier line navigated within the institution that invests resources in advancing the collective agenda, while the individuals push whichever parts of the scholarship agenda or advocacy agenda that they are best suited to.
Okay, that's really helpful. So we have some questions in the Q&A about data, and how do we generate data? How do we get data around social factors in the work that we do, and how difficult it can be to collect it? I will say, even in our own department, it's hard to navigate the process of collecting it, or even around our own faculty and learners and trainees, let alone our patients and the populations we serve. Do you have thoughts about how to generate and get access to the right kinds of data so that we can overlay these, the maps that you have shown us on the research questions that we ask?
Yeah, thank you. Meredith Brown, our Chief of Staff, will actually send a link in the chat to a report that from a commission that I chaired past couple of years about data determinants and decision-making. And the idea behind the commission was that really to ask the question, how does one think about the data one needs to best characterize the full range of determinants so that we can make better decisions as societies? And I think there are many complex questions that emerge about data. So I appreciate the question very much, because there is in some respects, there's an easy question about the nature of data and having the right data to be able to infer very complex associations that drive health. But there are harder questions around data ownership, where data come from, and how one answers back to the communities from where the data come. So I think this is, I think we need to think of data in a much more comprehensive way than we have in the past. If Meredith's not on, I'll send the link in a second.
Okay, that's great, thanks. You're a Dean of Public Health. Would you, and you're a family physician, would you strengthen ties between family medicine and public health? Would you integrate family medicine and public health in a perfect world? Are these, I'm fond of saying we're a Department of Family and Community Medicine, the DFCM acronym. What's the C for? What does it mean to serve community? And is the line between public health and family medicine or primary care a false line?
Yeah, so here's my ideal. Like, if I had the proverbial magic wand that shape the universe, I think we would drop the word public from public health. I think that's actually a distracting word. I think the way we would see it, there is the enterprise, the academic enterprise of generating health. Within the academic enterprise of generating health, there are different approaches to that. One of those approaches is through primary care. Another one of those approaches is through secondary, tertiary care. Another one of those approaches is through thinking about the health of the community and the policies that emerge from that. And so I think we're ultimately all part of the same health enterprise. And, if I had as you said, I'm a dean of a school of public health. If I had my druthers, I would rename the school to make it a school of health. But, I don't have such powers, because I think it creates these divisions that are false. And, the intellectual and practical agenda is creating health so that people can go on and flourish. That's what we're all doing. And there are many different ways in which one needs to do that. One needs to make sure that we create the economic and social circumstances within which people can do that. There's another way to do that, which is to make sure that one can tend to communities and to families and primary care way. There's another way to do it, to make sure that we have the best possible oncology. These are all approaches to generating health. And I think our historical evolution has created divisions that are unhelpful. Now, in the short term, you're asking me, what should you do in the short term? Well, I look to be led by you about what a large and excellent Department of Family and Community Medicine, how it takes on this agenda.
That's great. No pressure. So there's a question in the chat from one of our colleagues from Thailand around generalism versus specialty and approaches. And this is a conversation we have in our department. As you know, we train family physicians, our faculty members and learners are steeped in family medicine, but we also have many folks in our department who have areas of enhanced skills. You yourself, as a person who also trained in emergency medicine, know well that family medicine training can lead to all kinds of areas of specialty from a primary care family medicine perspective, whether that's emergency medicine, whether it's palliative care, care of the elderly, mental health and addictions, et cetera. And this is something that we know is a tension in our discipline. How do we embrace the full scope of primary care disciplines and the work that family doctors do, and also advance comprehensive, generalist, community-based primary care, which everybody needs access to. And we all know that everyone needs access to that. And so our Thai colleague is asking, in Thailand, there's a debate about generalism and versus specialty care, and academic institutions are proposing that family doctors become specialists in palliative care and geriatrics and other areas. What would your view be as a person who takes the public health perspective on how we integrate or do that dance between generalism and specialty approaches?
Well, being situated in the US for the past 2 decades, it's interesting to actually hear the question, because sitting from this side of the border, Canada has such a better grip on this question than the US does. And it is, in the US, I'll just use the US example for a second. There's a constant debate about the healthcare system, about paying for the healthcare system. People know it's sort of emerged into a big political issue. And what is missed constantly in the American conversation is that it's not simply about how one pays for healthcare, but actually how one structures healthcare. And the part that's missing in the American structure of healthcare is primary care, which is in the system, sort of a generally speaking, much more marginalized part of healthcare than it is in Canada. I mean, there's just no comparison between the two. So I do not see how one can structure a forward-looking healthcare system that understands that the health of individual is inextricable from the health of the world around us without a robust primary care. I'm using that term generically, intentionally, at the heart of that healthcare system. Now, whether that takes the form of primary care, to use sort of the metaphor, quarterbacking the specialist care. I mean, that now gets into sort of complicated payment issues and all that. But the people in the community fundamentally need a connection to the healthcare system, and that connection simply cannot come through anyone except through a primary care provider, because it's by simple virtue of the fact that people are multiple organ systems. Having your primary connection being through an organ system doctor is never going to be good enough. So I suppose you're asking a question that again, from this side of the border, Canada is decades ahead of where the US is. And it seems to me like the place you are in is to lead the world through example and through improvement over something where you're already at a very high level.
Okay, that's very thoughtful. I want to turn to a question about clinician well-being. And there's a question about people feeling burnt out, not only, of course, because everybody's working hard for the last couple of years and it's been a stressful time, but also because witnessing poor health in the community, poor health for our patients, and feeling disempowered by what we've all been working through over the last couple of years can be really emotionally challenging. Do you have advice for us about addressing the emotional and intellectual well-being of our own healthcare providers, our faculty members, our learners?
Yeah, I think it's been an awful time for the world, and it's been an awful time in particular for those who have been most affected by the pandemic. And in those, I mean, I talked quite a bit, obviously, in my brief remarks about the people who bore the brunt of the pandemic, but on the other side of that have been the any label you want to give it, essential workers, the care providers who have dealt with the direct consequences of the pandemic, and family doctors have been very much there. So I think the issue of clinician burnout, clinician fatigue is a real one. How does one deal with it? I think number one acknowledges it. Number two, one acknowledges that the mission of what we do doesn't pause and doesn't go away. So yes, we are feeling the consequences of the moment, and I think it is on institutions to make sure that there are mechanisms to allow people the respite they need. I think it's on individuals to recognize what they need to restore and refresh, because we don't have the option, and the world should not give us the option of simply opting out for the next 6 months or a year, because simply the mission goes forward, and the importance of our mission has never been higher than it is now. So I think there is an individual responsibility to recognize what individuals' limits are and what we, each of us, need to do in order to restore ourselves to health and function. And there's an institutional responsibility to recognize the groups within institutions who need help the most and to provide those resources. And with those two, I think I come back to optimism. We collectively need to move past the moment of fatigue and burnout through compassion for those who need to be supported through the moment, through pragmatic structures that can support each of us who need help, but collectively recognizing that we want to move forward so that we can actually continue to serve our mission.
Very well put. And I am fond of saying that I think in addition to rest, which we all need from time to time, the cure for burnout is purpose. So I think that there's much that we can do to build structures to institutionalize the optimism that you're talking about, that I really think is critical. A final question from one of our community-based physicians who rightly asks, when we talk about leadership in the universe of social factors that you're talking about, most family docs are not capital A academics. Most are not practicing, spending a good chunk of their week doing research. Most are out in the field, seeing patients all day, every day. What advice do you have to that great majority of family physicians out there in communities for how they can respond to what you're talking about?
Yeah, most of us, and perhaps all of us, are never the everything in the world that we want to be. We're all individuals. We all have limited scope. I suppose the way I've dealt with that question is to be part of institutions where the sum is greater, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts of each of us as individuals. Perhaps I'll end my last comment on purpose, because I was actually going to bring up purpose. I think it gives one purpose to be part of a unit like this one, where you know that what you are doing is part of a collective that aspires to something that is worth being a part of. And I think it's number one. Number two, then at the individual level, I think we all have a responsibility and a place of privilege in society to articulate what it is we are trying to do in our day-to-day interactions with colleagues and with our patients. And I think if every single clinician understands the story of health, understands the story of health in a generative way, that we can shift the public conversation. That gets to one of the three things that I actually argued is what Departments of Academic and Family Community Medicine can do and can do well. But fundamentally, the world is a better place for having outstanding clinicians, outstanding educators, outstanding scholars as part of a Department of Family and Community Medicine that sees its role as creating a healthier world. That is actually the kind of world I want to live in. So thank you all for doing that.
Thank you, Sandro. And I am marked forever by your statement. I quote, "If I could choose to live at any time in history, I would choose tomorrow." We'll be shamelessly stealing that as we think about our own strategic plan and the future of our department. And we're so grateful to you, not only for your talk today, but more importantly, for all of the work that you do in service of public health. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's really a privilege to be with you all.
Alison, I'm going to pass back to you to introduce the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Galea and Dr. Martin, for that exceptional start to our conference. You've given us a lot to ponder, ideas for exploration and innovation as we move forward from the pandemic. So thank you so much. I did want to note that in appreciation of Dr. Galea's presentation today, we have purchased 100 copies of his book, The Contagion Next Time. I know Dr. Martin mentioned that as well. And this will be given to all of our presenters and facilitators for today, as well as the first 50 who registered for the conference. So those of you that have been selected to receive a copy will receive an email from us asking for your preferred mailing address. So please keep an eye out for that.